oyster shells into Charlotte Harbor today to help boost water quality and help our fish and anglers. The shells act as a natural filter to get toxins out of the ecosystem.
For years, restaurant kitchens up and down the Florida coast treated oyster shells the way most of us treat any kitchen scrap, as garbage. Shucked, emptied, tossed in a bin, hauled to a landfill. Nobody thought twice about it. Then a group of scientists and conservation agencies decided to try something that sounded, on paper, almost too simple to matter. Instead of burying those shells in the ground, they would return them to the sea. Not gently, not one bucket at a time. By the barge load dumped onto the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of thousands of tons of them piled onto bare, lifeless sand. What happened next is one of the most quietly remarkable ecological turnarounds documented on the American coastline in the last 2 decades, and it started with something almost everyone had written off as trash. To understand why anyone would dump 500,000 tons of shell into the ocean, you have to understand what Florida's Gulf Coast had lost. Oyster reefs once stretched across enormous swaths of the Gulf shoreline, dense, living, self-renewing structures that filtered water, buffered storms, and hosted an extraordinary range of marine life. Decades of overharvesting, pollution, and coastal development stripped much of that away. Scientists with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration have estimated that oyster populations across the Gulf of Mexico have fallen by roughly 85% or more from historic levels. That is not a gradual decline. That is a near-total collapse of one of the coast's most important natural infrastructures. The consequence wasn't just fewer oysters. It was fewer of everything oysters make possible. Oyster reefs are what ecologists call foundation species. Remove them, and you don't just lose oysters, you lose the physical scaffolding that dozens of other species depend on to survive. Without reef structure, juvenile fish have nowhere to hide from predators. Without oyster filtration, water clouds with algae and sediment. Without the reef's physical bulk, waves hit the shoreline with nothing to slow them down. Florida's coastal managers were watching all 3 problems compound at once, and traditional solutions, concrete breakwaters, rock revetments, engineered seawalls, were expensive, rigid, and in storm after storm, prone to eventual failure. Meanwhile, there was another problem hiding in plain sight. Baby oysters, called spat, need something hard to attach to in order to grow. In a healthy reef system, that hard surface is provided by the shells of previous generations of oysters, built up over centuries into a dense limestone-like platform. But when the reefs disappear, the substrate disappears with them. Drifting oyster larvae have nowhere to land. No landing surface means no new generation. No new generation means the reef can never rebuild itself, even if the water quality around it improves. It's a trap, a species locked out of its own recovery by the absence of the very structure it needs in order to grow. The idea that took shape among Florida's fisheries and wildlife agencies, along with university researchers and coastal nonprofits, was to close that loop. If oyster larvae need old shell to settle on, and restaurants and seafood processors were throwing away enormous quantities of exactly that material every single day, then the shortage of substrate wasn't really a shortage at all. It was a distribution problem. The shells existed. They were just ending up in landfills instead of the water. So shell recycling programs began popping up around the state, some run by state agencies, some by university extension programs, some by conservation nonprofits and volunteer groups. Restaurants set out bins by the dish pit. Seafood processing plants set aside their shucking waste instead of trucking it to a dump. Volunteers picked up the material, let it cure in the open air for months at a time to break down any residual organic matter, and then loaded it onto barges and trucks bound for the coast. Over the years, these combined efforts, spanning agencies like the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, and a range of local partners, have moved staggering quantities of shell back into coastal waters, deposited as reef base near places like Cedar Key, Charlotte Harbor, and other historically oyster-rich stretches of the Gulf Coast. It wasn't universally popular. Some longtime fishermen were skeptical, even hostile, to the idea of piling shell onto the seafloor near grounds their families had fished for generations. Dumping anything into the ocean, even something as seemingly benign as old shell, tends to raise alarm, and understandably so. The history of ocean dumping in the 20th century is not a proud one. Environmental advocates asked hard questions about smothering existing habitat, disrupting sediment flow, and whether this was conservation or just a convenient way to avoid landfill fees. Those concerns weren't unreasonable, And in fact, they shaped how the programs were eventually designed, with careful site selection, permitting, and monitoring built in from the start, precisely to avoid the outcomes critics feared. Here's the part that surprised even people who had spent their careers studying oyster ecology. Oyster shell isn't inert. It's chemically active. Shell is made primarily of calcium carbonate, and as it sits in seawater, it slowly dissolves at its surface, releasing calcium ions into the water immediately around it. That creates small, localized zones of chemistry. They're subtly more favorable to other calcium-loving organisms, barnacles, tubeworms, and, critically, juvenile oysters looking for a place to settle. In other words, the shell doesn't just provide a physical platform. It actively primes the water chemistry around itself to encourage more shell-building life to move in. Within days of a shell pile settling on the bottom, bacteria begin colonizing its surface, forming thin biofilms, essentially living carpets a few cells thick that transform bare mineral surface into something biologically active. Within weeks, diatoms and microalgae move into those biofilms, followed by tiny crustaceans and some drifting larvae of various invertebrates. Every one of those organisms is food for effing slightly larger, and that something is food for something larger still. Long before any oyster or fish is visible to the naked eye, an entire microscopic food web has already assembled itself on what used to be a flat, sandy nothing. That's the part sandy seafloor simply cannot do on its own. Loose sand offers no fixed surface for anything to attach to, no chemical microzones, no structural complexity, nothing for a barnacle or a larval oyster to grab onto and start building. It is, ecologically speaking, close to a dead end for reef-forming life. The moment you introduce hard, chemically active shell material into that environment, you give the whole system something it fundamentally lacked, a place to start. Once that invisible groundwork is in place, the actual oysters follow. Drifting oyster larvae that would otherwise die without ever finding a surface to settle on suddenly have a concentrated landing zone waiting for them, positioned wherever coastal currents happen to carry the recycled shell. Researchers monitoring these restoration sites across the Gulf have documented juvenile oysters attaching to deposited shell in numbers far beyond what a bare sand control site ever produces, often described as the difference between a site teeming with new growth and a site with next to nothing. And the process is self-perpetuating in a way concrete or steel structures never can be. Oysters that settle and mature eventually reproduce, sending out larvae of their own that settle on the very structure their parents built. When an oyster dies, its shell stays in place, adding to the reef's mass and providing yet more surface for the next generation. Over a handful of years, a scattered pile of recycled shell can grow, vertically as layers of living and dead oyster accumulate, and horizontally as the reef edge expands outward into surrounding sediment. Nobody has to keep adding material forever. Once the cycle catches, the reef begins building itself. That shift changed minds that had been firmly set against these programs. Charter captains who had spent years fishing the same stretches of water and who had originally opposed shell deposition on the grounds that it would disturb the fishing grounds their families depended on began reporting the opposite of what they feared, fish stacking up around the new reef structure in numbers they hadn't seen in decades. It's one thing for a scientific survey to show improvement. It's another for the people who make their living on the water and who had every reason to be skeptical to watch it happen with their own eyes and change their minds. Reef fish are opportunists. The instant structural complexity appears where there was only flat sand before. Fish move in to use it for shelter from predators, for feeding on invertebrate life coating the shell, and eventually for spawning. Researchers studying these restored sites have consistently found something important. The increase in fish isn't simply fish relocating from somewhere nearby. Juvenile fish counts, animals actually born and surviving to maturity at the reef site, make up a substantial share of the increase, which tells scientists the reef is producing new biomass, not just concentrating fish that already existed elsewhere. That distinction matters enormously because it's the exact weakness that has long dogged more traditional artificial reefs, sunken ships, concrete reef balls, and similar structures. Those can look impressive in a fish survey, but much of what they attract is simply redistribution, fish gathering around a new landmark rather than any real increase in the population. A living oyster reef, by contrast, restarts biological processes that have been broken for decades: reproduction, filtration, habitat creation. And those processes keep running on their own, producing new life season after season without additional human intervention. As the fish arrive, the rest of the food web follows in a fairly predictable cascade. Species that hide and hunt among structurally complex reef surfaces, small predatory fish, crustaceans, mollusks, move in first. Larger predators follow the smaller fish. Sea turtles have been documented foraging on the invertebrate communities that coat mature reef surfaces. Dolphins have been observed working the edges of these reefs, hunting the dense schools of fish the structure now supports. Every new arrival reinforces the layer beneath it, and the system becomes progressively more stable and more complex the longer it's left alone. Fish and reef structure tend to get the most attention, but the water quality benefits of a restored oyster reef may be even more consequential, and they come from something almost embarrassingly simple. Oysters are filter feeders. A single adult oyster can filter somewhere in the range of dozens of gallons of seawater per day, pulling suspended particles, excess nutrients, and algae out of the water column as it feeds. Scale that up across a reef with hundreds of thousands of oysters, and you have a natural filtration system processing an enormous volume of water every single day, with no pumps, no electricity, and no maintenance bill. That matters a great deal on Florida's Gulf Coast, where agricultural and urban runoff regularly dumps excess nitrogen and phosphorus into coastal waters. Those nutrients feed harmful algal blooms, the kind that cloud water, starve it of oxygen, and periodically trigger mass fish kills. For decades, that kind of nutrient pollution has been treated mostly as a problem for engineers and regulators to manage after the fact. Restored oyster reefs attack it at the source, continuously, as a side effect of oysters simply doing what oysters do to survive. The clearer water that results has its own downstream effects. Seagrass beds, which require sunlight to survive, and which serve as critical nursery habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, need water clear enough for light to reach the bottom. As oyster reefs improve water clarity in the surrounding area, seagrass has room too. Expand into zones that had previously been too murky to support it, and seagrass, once established, stabilizes sediment and reduces turbidity even further, reinforcing the same improvement in water quality that helped it take root in the first place. One restoration effort ends up quietly supporting another. Coastal restoration projects tend to get judged on calm weather metrics, fish counts, water samples, biodiversity surveys. The real test came from something nobody scheduled: hurricane season. Florida's Gulf Coast has been repeatedly hit by major storms in the years since large-scale shell restoration began, and in the aftermath of these storms, researchers and coastal managers have consistently found that shorelines backed by restored oyster reef experience measurably less erosion than unprotected stretches of coast nearby. The mechanism is straightforward once you see it. A dense, irregular, three-dimensional reef structure breaks up wave energy before it ever reaches the shoreline. Smooth sand or a flat seawall gives incoming waves nothing to fight against. A reef, layered with living oysters stacked on generations of shell, is the opposite of smooth. It's all friction and irregularity, and that irregularity absorbs and dissipates wave energy that would otherwise slam directly into the coast. In storm after storm, that difference has translated into real, measurable reductions in shoreline erosion and property damage in areas fronted by restored reef. This is where oyster reefs reveal an advantage that no engineered structure can match. They don't just resist storm damage, they recover from it and get stronger. A seawall that cracks in a hurricane stays cracked until someone pays to repair it. Concrete degrades. Steel corrodes. An oyster reef that loses material in a storm typically sees a burst of new larval settlement in the aftermath, as fresh surface becomes available and the reproductive cycle kicks back into gear. Each subsequent generation adds height and structural complexity. The barrier tends to come out of a bad storm season not weaker, but on a trajectory to be more resilient the next time, a kind of natural self-repair that no engineered coastal defense currently replicates at anywhere near the same cost. That cost differential is significant. Traditional hard engineering, seawalls, rock armoring, concrete revetments, typically runs into the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars per mile to install and requires ongoing maintenance indefinitely. Oyster reef restoration programs, by contrast, have achieved comparable or better erosion protection in documented cases at a small fraction of that cost, and the protection tends to improve over time rather than degrade, without requiring continued investment once the reef establishes itself. Perhaps the most striking long-term finding from these restoration efforts is how much the reefs have expanded beyond the footprint of the material originally deposited. The oldest restoration sites have, in documented cases, roughly doubled in total area since the initial shell was placed, spreading outward in every direction without any additional human input. The mechanism is the oyster life cycle itself, running on repeat. Each generation settles on existing structure, matures, dies, and leaves its shell behind as substrate for the next wave of larvae. Vertical accumulation, horizontal spread, indefinitely, as long as water quality and larval supply hold up. The structural complexity of these reefs has also increased dramatically over time. What starts as an irregular pile of loose shell gradually becomes something architecturally intricate. Vertical relief, gaps and crevices between dense clusters of living oysters, overhangs and interlocking surfaces that create dozens of distinct microhabitats within a relatively small footprint. Crabs, small octopuses, sea stars, and juvenile fish exploit different parts of that structure simultaneously. What began as substrate has become an ecosystem in its own right. There's also growing scientific interest in what these reefs do for carbon. Dense oyster reefs and the sediments around them can act as a sink for organic carbon, locking away material that might otherwise contribute to ocean acidification and atmospheric warming. That's led some researchers to start framing oyster restoration not just as a habitat and coastal defense strategy, but as a modest, low-cost piece of a broader climate adaptation toolkit, an added benefit that wasn't really the point of the original programs, but has become part of the case for expanding them. What started as a Florida-specific effort to solve a local waste and habitat problem has become something closer to a template. Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana have all developed their own shell recycling and reef restoration programs in the years since, often with direct federal support. NOAA's Office of Habitat Conservation has funded multi-state restoration efforts spanning Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, and Texas specifically because the underlying model has proven itself repeatedly. Programs modeled on the same basic principle have appeared well outside the Gulf as well, including large urban restoration efforts working to rebuild oyster habitat in heavily degraded waterways. The concept researchers and coastal planners increasingly use to describe this approach is circular environmental design, the idea that material once treated purely as waste, whether oyster shell, coral rubble, or other calcium-based debris, can be deliberately repurposed as functional ecological infrastructure, rather than something to be disposed of and forgotten. It's not a stopgap measure or a public relations gesture.